My mom ate dinner with us every night for 3 years and never noticed my plate was always empty. My father only wanted to starve one of his children, me, not my perfect brother with his effortless athlete's build and his name stitched onto 3 varsity jackets. Just me, the eldest son who took up too much space. When I was 11, we were all sitting around the table when my mom asked, "Why is Micah's plate empty?" Before I could speak, I felt Dad's heavy hand clamp down on the back of my neck. He already ate. Had a big snack after practice, didn't you, champ? My mom smiled and went back to her food, distracted. And from there, my dad got crafty. My mom's 16-hour nursing shifts meant mealtime was his territory. By the time I turned 13, the routine was carved in stone. Every morning at 6:55 a.m., while mom was already gone to the hospital, Dad would make me stand on the scale he kept hidden in the garage behind the tool chest. 112 lb, he'd announced that particular morning, his voice tight with disappointment. Up 2 lb from yesterday. No breakfast or lunch today. But Dad, the doctor said, I'm growing. I was then cut off by the sound of him pulling out the lunch boxes. My little brother Theo's got a sandwich, chips, a granola bar. Mine got 3 celery sticks and a single rice cake. Dad, please. Shh. He pressed a finger to his lips. Do you hear that? That's your mom's car pulling out of the driveway. Unless you want Theo to skip meals too. You'll smile and say goodbye like a good son. And I never told my mom directly, but I gave signs. Is it normal to feel dizzy when you stand up? I asked her once over dinner. My dad's laugh was easy and warm, the kind that filled a room and made people trust him. You know how teenage boys are, always growing 3 inches overnight and forgetting to drink water. I was the same at his age. By winter, things were falling apart in ways even Dad couldn't hide. My hair was coming out in clumps, leaving them in the shower drain because I was too tired to clean up. And after I got caught fainting at practice, my punishment was watching the family eat pizza while I had ice water. Mom texted that she was getting off her shift early, and Dad scrambled to make me a plate that looked normal from a distance. When she walked in, she relaxed. Good, everyone's eating. That was when I stopped fighting. I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't see the skeleton everyone else saw. I saw what Dad had been telling me for years. Too much space, too much weight, too much everything. You're right, I told him at breakfast. I'm disgusting. I don't deserve food. For the first time in 2 years, he looked uncertain. Well, maybe just a quarter of an apple. No, I'm too fat for food. You were right, Dad. You see, we both knew if I didn't eat anything, I would die. I was too depressed at that point to care anymore. But to Dad, it would mean lawsuits, court dates, potential life in prison. Mom noticed at dinner that night. Where's Micah's plate? I'm not hungry, I said, my voice flat. The room went silent, except for my stomach that was growling so loud it sounded angry. He's Dad started, but for once he didn't have a lie ready. I haven't seen Micah eat in 3 days, Mom said slowly, like she was putting pieces together. 2 days later, I collapsed right in front of her. We need to take him to the hospital, so you don't trust me? I'm his father, my dad responded sharply. That's not what Are you seriously undermining me in front of the boys? His voice cracked. I do everything, and it's still not enough for you. I'm sorry, you're right, you've been handling it. She dropped it. Then came my awards ceremony in May. I won an academic achievement award. Turns out when you can't sleep from hunger, you have a lot of time to study. Walking to the stage felt like moving through water, and on the way up, my sleeve slid back to show a wrist that looked like a bundle of dry twigs. Someone gasped when I collapsed to the floor, unable to move. Micah. Mom's voice cut through everything. She was standing, finally seeing what the baggy clothes had hidden. Dad rushed the stage like he'd been shot from a cannon. Eat something, he was shouting, trying to force it into my mouth in front of 300 people. But Dad, I said into the microphone, calm as death. You said I'm too fat. Remember? Every morning when you weigh me. Mom's entire face stretched as everything clicked at once. The last thing I heard before passing out was Theo's voice, high and scared, finally telling the truth. Dad made me put laxatives in Micah's food when he did eat. I woke up in the hospital to the sound of Mom crying. 126 lb, she kept saying. My son is 6 feet tall and weighs 126 lbs, and I ate dinner with him every night. The doctor's voice was professionally calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of disgust. Mrs. Vance, he's been systematically starved for approximately 3 years. His heart shows signs of chronic malnutrition. If he'd continued for another 48 hours, we'd be having a very different conversation. Dad played his last card from across the room where a security guard was watching him. He made me do it, he said, voice steady as a snake. She's obsessed with having lean sons. I was protecting him from worse. They removed Mom from the house that night, pending investigation. Dad's story was convincing enough to create doubt, and Theo was too scared to say anything. And as I lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by heart monitors and IV drips, I smiled because I knew what I had to do to get revenge on Dad and make it right. The beeping monitors pulled me back to consciousness the next morning, and I stared at the ceiling tiles while making myself a promise that this wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about fixing everything Dad had broken. My body felt hollow and strange, like a house with all the furniture removed. And when the doctor came in carrying a thick folder, her face looked worried in a way that made my chest tight. She sat down next to my bed and explained that my body was in something called refeeding syndrome, which meant if they gave me normal amounts of food right away, my organs could actually shut down from the shock. They had to increase my calories by tiny amounts each day, monitoring my heart and blood levels constantly. And even though Dad was somewhere else in the building, it felt like he was still controlling what went into my body through these medical rules. The IV drip felt cold going into my arm while she talked about phosphate levels and cardiac monitoring, and I nodded along even though the words felt distant and unreal. Later that afternoon, a man with a shaved head and tired eyes walked in carrying a clipboard, introducing himself as Roland Ashcroft from Child Protective Services, and right behind him came Dad, who immediately rushed to my bedside with fake tears streaming down his face. Dad grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard enough to hurt, while Roland asked me questions questions about what had been happening at home, and every time I tried to explain about the morning weigh-ins, Dad would interrupt with gasps and sobs about how Mom had been obsessed with having lean sons. I tried to tell Roland about the scale in the garage and the 112 lb goal, but my voice kept shaking and Dad kept talking over me, saying things about Mom commenting on our weight and making him enforce her rules. Roland wrote everything down, but I could see the confusion in his eyes, especially when Dad started talking about being a victim too, trapped between his wife's demands and trying to protect his sons. That evening, after Dad finally left with the security guard trailing behind him, another social worker came to tell me that Mom had been removed from our house while they investigated Dad's claims about her being the real abuser. The guilt hit me so hard I couldn't breathe properly, making the heart monitor beep faster while I realized this was all my fault for not speaking up sooner, for letting it get so bad that now Mom was punished for Dad's crimes. 3 days passed in a blur of blood draws and tiny meals that my stomach cramped around, and on the third day, I finally worked up the courage to tell my nurse about everything while he changed my IV bag. He listened without interrupting while I explained the daily weigh-ins at exactly 6:55 a.m. every morning, how Dad would make me stand on that hidden scale while Mom's car was pulling out of the driveway, and how he'd made Theo put laxatives in my food on the rare days when I was allowed to eat. The nurse wrote everything down in careful handwriting and promised to pass it along to my medical team, squeezing my shoulder gently before he left. The next morning, a tall doctor with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses came in and introduced herself as Dr. Elena Rhodes, explaining that she'd been asked to do a comprehensive examination to document any signs of long-term malnutrition. She was gentle but thorough, taking photographs of my thinning hair, the sores that wouldn't heal on my shins, the way my collarbones stuck out at sharp angles through my skin, and I could see anger building in her eyes, even though her voice stayed professional and calm. She ordered special x-rays that would show bone density loss and detailed blood work that could prove this had been happening for years, not just recently like Dad was claiming. On my 4th day in the hospital, Mr. Bramostel from my school came to visit, his arms full of get-well cards from classmates who probably whispered about me when I wasn't around. He sat on the edge of my bed and told me he'd been at the award ceremony, that he'd heard what I said into the microphone about Dad weighing me every morning, and he thought he could get the audio recording from the school's AV department. His eyes got wet when he looked at how thin my arms were, and he promised to do everything he could to help prove what really happened. 2 days later, Dad showed up at the hospital with a huge production, carrying bags of food and crying loudly in the hallway about how they were keeping him from his sick son, how he just wanted to feed me and make everything better. Security had to physically escort him out when he started shouting at the nurses about conspiracy theories and how everyone was turning his boy against him, and I watched through my door's window as he fought against their grip. The next afternoon, a woman in a sharp gray suit came to my room and introduced herself as Renata Voss, explaining that Mom had hired her to handle the custody case and figure out how to get us back. She spread papers across my bedside table and explained the timeline for custody hearings, what kind of evidence we'd need to gather, how the legal system moved slowly, but we had to document everything perfectly, and my head spun trying to understand all the complicated legal terms. A week after that first interview, Roland came back to talk to me again, this time without Dad present, but he kept asking questions that made me want to scream, like whether I might have misunderstood Dad's concern for my health, or if maybe Dad was just trying to help me be healthy. He seemed skeptical when I explained about the punishments for gaining even 1 pound, about watching my family eat pizza while I had ice water, about Dad telling me I was too fat to deserve food, and I could feel my chance at justice slipping away with every doubtful look he gave me. The next morning, Theo showed up at my hospital room with Dad standing right in the doorway, watching us like a hawk. My little brother's eyes were puffy and red while he walked over to my bed and gave me this tiny hug that felt like he was scared I might break. Dad stayed by the door with his arms crossed and this fake worried look on his face. Theo sat on the edge of my bed and started talking about school stuff and his friend's birthday party coming up. When Dad turned to talk to a nurse passing by, Theo quickly pressed something into my hand under the blanket. I felt the folded paper and kept my face blank while Dad turned back to watch us. Later, when they left, I opened the note and it just said, "I'm sorry," with a little heart drawn next to it. My eyes got wet because I knew he wanted to help, but was too scared of Dad to say anything out loud. That afternoon, I asked the nurse for a notebook and started writing down everything I could remember about the past 3 years. My hand cramped up after the first hour, but I kept going because getting it all on paper felt like taking back some control over my own story. I wrote about the morning weigh-ins at 6:55 a.m. and how Dad would make me strip down to my boxers to get the most accurate number. I wrote about the celery sticks and rice cakes for lunch while Theo got sandwiches and chips. I wrote about watching my family eat pizza while I had ice water and how Dad would smile at me across the table. I wrote about the laxatives Theo put in my food when Dad made him do it. I filled up 30 pages over 2 days and my wrist hurt so bad I could barely hold the pen by the end. But having it all written down made everything feel more real and less like some bad dream I couldn't wake up from. On my 5th day in the hospital, they started me on physical therapy and I could barely make it 10 ft down the hallway before my legs started shaking like jelly. The therapist was this quiet older man who held my arm while I took baby steps and didn't make me feel bad when I had to sit down after just a few minutes. He explained that my muscles had been eating themselves for years because my body didn't have any fat or food to use for energy. He said it would take months to build back the strength I'd lost and that some of the damage to my bones might be permanent. We worked for 20 minutes before I threw up from the effort and he helped me back to bed while telling me we'd try again tomorrow. Meanwhile, Renata was working on getting an emergency protective order so Mom could come see us without breaking the investigation rules. She filed all the paperwork and included my written pages about what Dad did to me. 3 days later, she called called to say the judge denied it because we didn't have enough proof yet that Dad was the one hurting me instead of Mom. The anger that hit me was like fire in my chest. And I told Renata we had to find more evidence because I couldn't stand Mom being punished for something Dad did. She promised she was working on it but said the legal system moves slow and we had to be patient. The next day, Mr. Ostel showed up with a USB drive that was supposed to have the audio from my awards ceremony. We played it on his laptop, but the quality was so bad you could barely hear anything except crowd noise and some muffled talking. You could kind of make out me saying something about being too fat, but the exact words were lost in the static. He looked so disappointed and promised he'd check with the school's AV department because they usually had better equipment recording these events. I thanked him for trying, even though I wanted to scream about how unfair it was that the one time I told the truth in public, we couldn't even use it as proof. Roland came back 2 days later with a folder full of papers from my school. He'd gotten the athletic trainer's records showing all the times I'd fainted or felt dizzy over the past 2 years. There were 17 different incidents documented with dates and times and notes about how thin I looked. He added them to his case file and said it was helping build a pattern, even if it wasn't the smoking gun we needed. At least he wasn't looking at me like I was lying anymore, which felt like some kind of progress. A week into my hospital stay, the discharge planner came to explain that I couldn't go home while the investigation was happening. She said they were arranging for me to go to a step-down recovery program, which was like a halfway house for kids with eating problems. I wanted to get out of the hospital so bad, but I also knew I needed somewhere safe where Dad couldn't get to me. The place was 40 minutes away, which meant I'd have to change schools if I stayed there long enough. While all this was happening, Dad started posting on social media about how he was being falsely accused and kept from his sick son. Kids from the school started screenshotting his posts and sending them to me through Instagram. He wrote long paragraphs about how much he loved me and how the system was failing our family. He posted old pictures of us looking happy at the lake or at the county fair. The comments were split between people supporting him and people who'd seen me collapse at the ceremony. Reading them made my stomach hurt, even though I knew every word he wrote was a lie designed to make himself look like the victim. Elena came in on day 9 with a whole stack of lab results that showed exactly how messed up my body was from years of starving. My iron levels were so low I needed supplements. My heart showed signs of damage. My bone density was like an old man's, and my hormone levels were all over the place. She explained each test result and what it meant in terms that proved this had been happening for years, not just recently. Seeing all those numbers and charts made everything feel more real than just my word against Dad's. She said she'd write up a detailed report for the court that would be hard for anyone to argue with. That same afternoon, Renata called to say she was subpoenaing the pharmacy records from the 3 stores near our house. She wanted to show Dad's pattern of buying laxatives in bulk every few weeks for the past 2 years. She was building a timeline that would match up with my worst days at the school when I'd collapse or have to go home sick. The legal stuff was moving slow, but at least people were finally listening and trying to help, instead of just believing Dad's lies about Mom being the bad one. Roland showed up at the house 3 days later while I watched from the car window as Renata drove me past on our way to another meeting. He went inside with 2 other people carrying clipboards and cameras, and Dad must have been at work because his truck wasn't there. They stayed for almost 2 hours taking pictures of everything. Later that afternoon, Roland called Renata and told her what they found in the garage behind the tool chest. The scale was still there, pushed against the back wall, and someone had scratched tiny marks into the concrete beside it, like a prisoner counting days. There were hundreds of them going up the wall in groups of 7. Roland took photos from every angle and said his hands were shaking when he realized each mark probably meant a morning I'd stood on that thing. The next day, Dad found out about the search because the neighbors told him they saw people going through our house. Within hours, he'd gone to the grocery store and bought enough food to feed a small army. When Roland went back for the follow-up visit 2 days later, the kitchen looked like something from a cooking magazine with fresh fruit bowls and meal planning charts stuck to the fridge. Dad had even printed out healthy recipe cards and left them scattered on the counter like he'd been using them for years. Watching from across the street where Renata parked so I could see, I wanted to scream at how good he was at this game. The step-down facility set me up with a therapist named Silas Brand who had this calm way of talking that made me feel less crazy. He taught me to write down facts in order without adding how I felt about them, just what happened and when. We practiced over and over how to tell my story without crying or getting angry, because he said judges listen better to facts than feelings. Every session we'd go through the timeline and he'd stop me whenever I started saying things like, I felt or it seemed like, and make me stick to what actually happened. It was harder than I thought it would be to just say the words without all the emotion wrapped around them. Mom finally got permission for a supervised visit after 2 weeks of lawyers arguing about it. She walked into the visiting room at the facility and just stood there staring at me like she was seeing a ghost. Then she dropped into the chair and started sobbing so hard her whole body shook. The supervisor had to get her water because she couldn't stop crying long enough to breathe properly. She kept saying she was sorry over and over until I finally told her to stop because Theo and I needed her to fight, not fall apart. She wiped her face and nodded and promised she'd do whatever it took to get us back. That same week, Mr. Ostel called to say he'd been digging through the school's AV equipment from the ceremony. The main recording was bad, but the auditorium had a built-in system for hearing impaired students that recorded everything separately. He played it for me over the phone, and you could hear everything crystal clear. My voice saying those words about Dad weighing me every morning, then Dad's panicked voice trying to force food in my mouth, then Theo's scared voice about the laxatives. Mr. Ostel burned copies onto 3 different drives and gave them to Renata, who said this was exactly what we needed. 2 nights later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. It was Theo calling from his friend's phone, whispering so quiet I could barely hear him. He said Dad had been taking him to doctor appointments for stomach stomach problems, but he wasn't sick, and the doctor kept asking weird questions about his eating. My whole body went cold because I knew exactly what Dad was starting. Theo said Dad told him not to tell anyone about the appointments and made him promise to keep it secret from Mom. I told him to tell someone at the school if he felt sick or scared, and he said okay before hanging up really fast. The next morning during my therapy session with Silas, I stood up too fast and the room started spinning. My legs gave out and I hit the floor hard enough to bruise my hip. Silas called Dr. Rhodes, who came over from the main hospital and checked my vitals while lecturing me about pushing too hard. She said the stress from all the legal stuff was making my recovery slower, and if I didn't slow down, I could end up back in the hospital, but I couldn't stop now. Not with Theo in danger and Dad still playing his games. Roland tried to talk to Theo at the school the following week, but called Renata afterwards sounding frustrated. He said Theo barely spoke and kept looking at the door like he wanted to run away. Every question got a shrug or an I don't know, and Roland couldn't get anything useful for the case. The system moved so slow while Dad had all the time in the world to coach him on what to say and what to keep quiet about. Renata met with me after that failed interview to explain that the judge wanted more proof before he'd grant a no-contact order. We had medical records and the recording and the scale photos, but apparently that wasn't enough to prove ongoing danger. I was so tired from fighting, but knew we had to keep pushing or Dad would win and Theo would end up like me. Renata pulled out her laptop and showed me the state recording laws, explaining that we lived in a one-party consent state, which meant I could legally record phone calls without telling the other person. She suggested I call Dad and try to get him talking about what he did to me. Just thinking about hearing his voice made my stomach hurt, but I knew it might be the evidence we needed to protect Theo and finally make this stop. The next afternoon, I sat in Renata's office with my phone on speaker between us while she hit record on her laptop. My hands were shaking so bad I had to sit on them when I dialed Dad's number. He picked up on the second ring with this fake, warm voice asking how his boy was doing. I told him I was confused about everything that happened and maybe we could talk about it. He jumped on that so fast, saying he only ever wanted what was best for me and how the doctors were blowing everything out of proportion. Then he started talking about how he was just teaching me discipline like any good father would, and how the morning weigh-ins were just to track my performance. He went on for 10 minutes about how kids today are soft and out of shape, and he was protecting me from being weak. The way he talked about controlling my food made my skin crawl, but Renata kept nodding at me to keep him talking. He said the scale was a tool for accountability, and that I should be grateful he cared enough to monitor my intake when other fathers let their sons get lazy and fat. When I asked about the laxatives Theo mentioned, he got quiet for a second, then said sometimes I needed help staying clean, and it was all natural anyway. After 20 minutes, Renata motioned to wrap it up, so I told him I had to go to therapy and hung up. She saved the recording to 3 different drives and said his language about control and monitoring was exactly what we needed, even without a full confession. 3 days later, Renata called me excited because the pharmacy records finally came through after her subpoena. She spread the papers across her desk, showing me the pattern she'd highlighted in yellow. Every 2 to 3 weeks, for the past 2 years, Dad had bought the same brand of laxatives in bulk, always paying cash but using his rewards card. The dates matched up perfectly with my worst days at the school that the trainer had documented. There was one week where he bought 3 boxes right before I collapsed during finals. Even Roland couldn't explain away such a clear pattern when Renata showed him the timeline matched with my medical records. He finally admitted this looked like systematic abuse and said he was pushing hard to get Theo placed somewhere safe immediately. But then he explained how the system worked and my heart sank. They needed to find an appropriate family member first. Then if that didn't work out, they'd look for emergency foster placement. But there was a shortage of homes willing to take teenagers. Every day that passed with Theo still in that house felt like I was failing him. I kept thinking about those weird doctor appointments he'd mentioned and what Dad might be doing to him now that I wasn't there to be the target. Roland promised he was checking on Theo every few days, but that didn't feel like enough when I knew how good Dad was at hiding things. The next week, Mr. Ostel called to say he'd gotten 5 teachers to write official statements about my collapses and weight loss over the years. He read parts of them to me over the phone, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment. My history teacher wrote about how I'd fallen asleep standing up during a presentation, and how my clothes hung off me like I'd borrowed them from someone twice my size. The coach said he'd tried to bench me during conditioning because my legs were like sticks, but I'd insisted on running anyway. My chemistry teacher wrote about finding me passed out in the bathroom, and how I'd begged her not to call anyone. They all mentioned noticing the dramatic weight loss, but feeling unsure about how to help without proof of what was happening at home. Mr. Ostel said their statements would carry weight because they were mandatory reporters who documented concerns. Dr. Rhodes spent a whole afternoon writing her medical report for the case, showing me parts of it during my checkup. She explained how the patterns in my blood work and organ damage were consistent with forced starvation, not self-restriction like in typical eating disorders. She wrote about how my heart showed specific signs of chronic malnutrition that took years to develop. The bone density scans revealed damage usually seen in elderly patients, not teenagers. She included charts showing how my weight had dropped in a pattern that suggested external control rather than internal mental illness. Her professional opinion stated clearly that this was medical child abuse, not a psychiatric eating disorder, and she attached all the test results as proof. The report was 15 pages long, and reading it made everything feel more real and horrible than when I was living through it. 2 weeks before the hearing, I was sitting in the day room at the step-down facility when a nurse came to get me. She said someone was causing a scene in the parking lot and security thought I should know. I looked out the window and saw Dad standing by his truck with grocery bags surrounding him, crying and waving at the building. He was yelling about wanting to feed his boy and how they were keeping him from taking care of me. Other patients' families were staring as he pulled out containers of food and held them up like offerings. Security was trying to get him to leave, but he kept crying about being a father who just wanted to nourish his child. I turned away from the window and went back to my room, proud that I didn't feel the need to respond to his performance. The staff filed an incident report about his trespassing and disturbing treatment, which Renata added to our evidence file. Then, suddenly, everything shifted into high gear when Renata called, saying the hearing had been moved up by 3 weeks due to a cancellation in the judge's schedule. We had 4 days to finalize everything instead of almost a month like we'd planned. I spent hours at her office organizing documents while she made copies and created exhibit labels. Silas rearranged his whole schedule to give me extra sessions to prepare for testifying. He had me practice answering the same questions over and over while he played the role of Dad's lawyer trying to trip me up. He taught me to take 3 deep breaths before answering anything and to keep my hands folded so I wouldn't fidget. We practiced what to do if I felt panic rising, how to ask for water if I needed a break, and how to keep my voice steady even when inside I wanted to scream. He reminded me that truth was on my side, and I just had to stick to facts without getting emotional. By the 4th session, I could answer even the nastiest questions without my voice shaking. During all this, Theo managed to visit me with one of Dad's friends, who didn't know he wasn't supposed to leave us alone together. The second the friend went to the bathroom, Theo pulled out this small notebook from his backpack. It was Dad's training log where he'd been tracking my weight and what I ate for years. Each page had dates, numbers, and notes about my compliance or resistance to his rules. Some entries described punishments for gaining even half a pound. Theo said he'd found it in the garage and snuck it out while Dad was at work. I wanted to cry seeing proof of everything written in Dad's own handwriting, but when I showed Renata, she said we had a problem. Since Theo had taken it without permission and given it to me directly, the chain of custody was broken, and Dad's lawyer could argue it was stolen or tampered with. We needed to establish its authenticity through proper legal channels. She sent it to a handwriting expert for analysis, but warned me the results wouldn't be ready before our new hearing date. The legal system's rules felt so frustrating when the evidence was right there in black and white, showing exactly what he'd done to me. Mom started going to parenting classes 3 times a week at the community center downtown. She'd sit in the front row taking notes like her life depended on it and brought home folders full of handouts about childhood trauma and protective parenting. Every session got documented with certificates and attendance sheets that Renata added to our court file. Watching her actually work on herself instead of just feeling guilty made something inside me start to trust her again. 2 weeks later, I went back to the school for half days starting with just morning classes. Kids stared at me in the hallways and whispered behind their hands because Dad's Facebook posts about being a persecuted father had gone viral in our town. Instead of hiding in the bathroom like I wanted to, I kept my head up and walked straight to class. The school counselor pulled me into her office that first day with paperwork for something called a 504 plan. It meant I could eat snacks during class whenever I needed to and take breaks to sit in the nurse's office if I felt weak. The official accommodations made me feel less like a freak and more like someone who deserved support. That night at the recovery facility, I woke up at 2 a.m. with my heart racing and couldn't catch my breath. My chest felt tight and my hands were shaking. But instead of hitting the panic button for staff, I used the breathing exercises Silas taught me. I counted backwards from 10 while picturing a safe place, and within 15 minutes my body calmed down. Getting through it alone felt like winning a small battle against the scared part of me. The next morning, Renata called to warn me that Dad filed an emergency motion claiming Mom was coaching me to lie. She already filed a counter motion with all our evidence, including the pharmacy records and medical reports. The legal papers flying back and forth made my head spin, but Renata said this was normal desperation tactics. 3 days later, a reporter from the local paper called the facility asking for a comment about teen eating disorders. The article came out that weekend without naming names, but everyone knew it was about us because it mentioned a recent award ceremony incident. The whole town was talking about it at the grocery store and coffee shops, which meant the court couldn't ignore the case anymore. Dr. Rhodes met with someone from the district attorney's office about filing criminal neglect charges against Dad. She showed them my medical charts and explained how systematic starvation differed from self-imposed restriction. Having actual law enforcement looking at criminal charges instead of just family court gave me real hope that Dad might face consequences. Meanwhile, Theo managed to do something incredible while staying at Dad's friend's house for a sleepover. He used the friend's phone to record Dad coaching him about what to tell the judge at the next hearing. Dad's voice on the recording was clear as he told Theo to say, "Mom never let us have seconds," and always commented on our weight. Theo gave the recording to Roland during a school visit, and my little brother's hands were shaking, but he stood tall. Roland immediately took the recording to his supervisor and pushed hard for Theo's emergency removal from Dad's custody. His supervisor wanted more documentation first, which made me so mad I threw my water bottle across my room. The system protecting Dad, while my brother was still in danger, felt completely backwards. Roland kept pushing, though, and documented every concern while building a stronger case. 2 days before the next court date, we finally got the call we'd been waiting for. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including Theo's recording, and ordered supervised contact only between Dad and both of us. It wasn't full protection since he could still see us with a court supervisor present, but it meant he couldn't be alone with us anymore. I sat on my bed at the facility and let myself feel relieved for the first time in weeks. 3 days later, at the supervised visit center, Dad sat across from us in a small room that smelled like old coffee and cleaning supplies. The supervisor, a bored-looking man with a lanyard, was checking his phone in the corner when Dad leaned forward and grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks. He whispered that we were destroying everything he'd worked for and that Mom would never be able to handle us alone without his guidance. I kept my face completely blank and didn't pull away even though his nails were digging into my skin. Theo Theo started crying, and the supervisor finally looked up, but Dad had already let go and was sitting back with an easy smile on his face. After the visit ended, I wrote down everything he said word for word in the notebook Renata gave me, and took pictures of the red marks on my wrist with my phone. The next week, Dad brought his mother into it. My grandmother showed up at the facility with a lawyer of her own, saying she wanted supervised visits and that her son was a good man being railroaded by a bitter wife. She sat across from me in the visiting room wearing her church clothes and told me that families forgive, that I was confused, that Dad had only ever wanted me to be strong. I stared at the tally marks I could still see in my head, the ones scratched into the garage concrete in groups of 7, and I told her calmly that Dad weighed me at 6:55 every morning and decided if I ate based on the number. She said I was being dramatic and left, and the next day she posted on Facebook that her grandson had been turned against the family by lies. Renata told me not to worry, that a grandmother's opinion carried no weight against medical records, but it still hurt to watch another adult choose Dad over the truth. 2 days after that, Renata hired a private investigator named Wendell Pruitt to dig into Dad's finances, because she suspected the abuse went deeper than food. Wendell spent a week pulling bank statements and credit card records, and what he found made my stomach turn. Dad had been draining the joint account for 2 years, moving money into an account Mom didn't know about, buying himself new tools and a boat while telling Mom they couldn't afford my dentist appointments. Wendell also found the pattern of laxative purchases lined up in the card statements, cashback rewards logged on the exact days that matched the pharmacy records. He built a spreadsheet that connected every purchase to a school incident and a hospital visit, and Renata said financial control was part of the same abuse, a way to keep Mom too stressed and too broke to notice what was happening at dinner. The next morning, Dr. Rhodes called Renata with news that made everything more urgent. She had quietly arranged, through Roland, to examine Theo during a routine school physical, and she'd found the early signs. Theo's weight had dropped 6 lb in a month. His iron was low. There were the beginnings of the same pattern she'd documented in me, just 3 years earlier in the timeline. She wrote it up carefully, noting that Theo was being taken to a gastroenterologist for problems that didn't exist, and that the appointments themselves looked like grooming, a way to build a fake medical history that Dad could later point to. Reading her report, I understood that Dad had simply moved on to his next target the moment I stopped being useful to him. That knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, and I told Silas about it in our next session, and for once, he let me be angry before he steered me back to the facts. A week later, the case hit a wall I didn't see coming. Roland got pulled off our file. His supervisor reassigned him without warning, and a new caseworker named Delphine Marsh took over, a woman who clearly hadn't read the file, and who kept asking me the same skeptical questions Roland had stopped asking weeks ago. She sat across from me with her arms crossed and asked whether I'd ever considered that my mother might have influenced my memories, whether the recordings could have been staged, whether a teenage boy might exaggerate a strict father into a monster. I felt the whole case sliding backward, all that progress erased because a stranger with a clipboard had decided ahead of time that fathers don't starve their sons. Renata was furious. She filed a formal complaint and requested Roland's reinstatement, attaching his detailed notes to prove how far the investigation had already come. For 9 days, nobody moved the case forward, and every one of those days was a day Theo spent in that house. I lay awake counting them, thinking about the granola bars and sandwiches in Theo's lunchbox that would soon become celery sticks and rice cakes. On the 10th day, Renata called to say the complaint had worked. Roland was back, and Delphine's skepticism had been noted as a concern by her own supervisor once she saw the pharmacy timeline and Dr. Rhodes's report side by side. Roland came to see me that afternoon and apologized for the system, said he'd never let himself get pulled off again, and told me he'd already scheduled an emergency staffing to push for Theo's removal. Meanwhile, Dad's online campaign had grown into something ugly. He'd started a fundraiser titled "Help a Falsely Accused Father Get His Boys Back," and it had raised almost $4,000 from strangers who'd never met me. He did a sit-down interview with a small local news channel, sitting in our living room with family photos arranged behind him, dabbing his eyes and talking about how the system tears good men apart. People I'd never met were sending me messages on Instagram calling me a liar and telling me I'd ruined my father's life. A few of them found the facility's phone number and called the front desk, pretending to be relatives. Security had to update the visitor list and flag his supporters. Watching him perform grief on television, so convincing that even I might have believed him if I hadn't lived it, taught me something about how easy it is to hide a monster behind a warm face and a good story. Silas helped me understand that Dad's need to control the narrative was the same impulse that made him control my food, and that every post and every interview was more evidence of the same pattern, so we saved them all. The handwriting expert's results came back 2 weeks later, and they were better than we'd hoped. The expert confirmed with high confidence that every entry in the training log was written by the same hand, Dad's hand, and that the ink and paper aging was consistent with entries made over a 2-year period, which killed Dad's lawyer's argument that the log had been recently faked. But the chain of custody problem remained, so Renata came up with a plan. She subpoenaed the original log directly from the facility where it was now being held as evidence, and she got Theo to give a formal statement to Roland describing exactly where he'd found it in the garage. So the log's origin was documented through proper channels instead of just my word. It was slow and it was frustrating, but piece by piece we were turning stolen evidence into admissible evidence. Dad's lawyer struck back the following week by producing a witness of his own. It was Coach Renfro, the man who ran the summer conditioning program Dad had signed me up for, and he wrote a statement saying he'd always known Dad as a devoted father who pushed his sons to be their best. He claimed he'd seen Mom criticize my eating at team dinners, that she was the one obsessed with weight, that Dad had only ever encouraged me. Reading his statement made my hands shake, because I remembered those team dinners, and I remembered Dad kicking me under the table whenever I reached for a second roll while Mom was in the bathroom. Renata wasn't rattled. She dug into Coach Renfro and found that Dad had loaned him money twice in the past year, small amounts that never got repaid, and that the two of them went fishing together on the boat Dad had secretly bought with the drained account. She subpoenaed the coach's own records and found his account of dates didn't line up, that half the team dinners he described had happened on nights Mom was working a shift and couldn't have been there at all. When she deposed him, he crumbled under the timeline, admitting he'd written the statement as a favor and hadn't really paid attention to who said what. Renata kept the deposition transcript ready to destroy him if he ever took the stand. A few days after that, Renata subpoenaed Dad's phone records and search history through a court order, and what came back removed any last shred of doubt anyone could have had. The search history showed a man who had researched exactly how far he could push a growing boy's body, who had looked up the warning signs that doctors watch for and how to explain them away, who had searched for how child abuse investigations get started and how fathers get custody. There were searches timed to the exact weeks when I'd collapsed, searches that showed he'd known precisely what he was doing and had spent his evenings learning how to avoid getting caught. Renata printed the whole history and flagged the worst entries, and she said no jury and no judge could look at that list and still believe Dad was a confused, loving father. The search history also revealed something that made my blood run cold. In the 2 weeks since I'd been removed from the house, the searches had shifted. Now they were about Theo. Now they were about the same body, the same methods, the same explanations, aimed at my little brother. Renata took the phone records straight to Roland, and Roland took them straight to his supervisor, and this time nobody asked for more documentation. Within 48 hours, an emergency order came through removing Theo from Dad's custody and placing him temporarily with our maternal grandfather, a quiet man who lived 2 towns over and who drove straight to the facility to see me the day Theo moved in with him. My grandfather sat by my bed and held my hand and told me that he'd suspected for years that something was wrong, that he'd seen how thin I'd gotten at holidays, and that he'd let Dad's easy explanations talk him out of trusting his own eyes. He cried and apologized, and I told him the only thing that mattered now was keeping Theo safe, and he promised me that Theo would never skip a meal under his roof. That night was the first night in months that I slept without waking up at 2 a.m. because for the first time, Theo was somewhere Dad couldn't reach him. But Dad didn't accept the order quietly. 3 days after Theo moved in with our grandfather, Dad showed up at the school during dismissal and tried to convince Theo to get in his truck, telling him Mom had abandoned them and that they should run away together and start fresh somewhere new. A teacher on car line duty recognized Dad from the news and stepped between them, and the school went into a soft lockdown while security walked Theo back inside. The whole thing was caught on the school's parking lot cameras, Dad's truck idling at the curb, Dad leaning out the window, the teacher blocking the door. Renata got the footage, and she said an attempted custodial interference caught on camera was worth more than 100 pages of testimony because it showed the court exactly who Dad was when he thought no one was watching. The incident also finally moved the district attorney's office to act. The ADA, who'd been reviewing my medical charts, filed formal criminal charges, 3 counts, child endangerment, criminal neglect, and attempted custodial interference. A warrant went out, and Dad turned himself in with his lawyer and his mother and a small crowd of his online supporters holding signs outside the courthouse. He posted bail within hours and went right back to his fundraiser, this time framing the arrest as proof of persecution. But something had shifted in the town. The parking lot video had leaked, and people who'd been sending him money started asking questions, and the comment sections that used to defend him filled up with strangers who'd finally seen enough. Right in the middle of all this, my own body betrayed me again. I woke at the facility one morning with my heart skipping and racing at the same time, my vision going gray at the edges, and the staff called an ambulance. I spent 4 days back in the main hospital while Dr. Rhodes ran tests and adjusted my medication, explaining that the arrhythmia was a lingering effect of the years of starvation, that a heart forced to run on nothing for that long doesn't just heal on a schedule. She said the stress of the case was making it worse, and she gently suggested I let the adults carry more of the weight, but I couldn't, not when I could see the finish line. Lying in that hospital bed hooked up to monitors again, I made myself go over the whole timeline one more time, every date, every piece of evidence, everything Silas had taught me about facts over feelings, because in 2 weeks, I was going to sit in a witness stand and I was not going to let my body or Dad's lawyer take this away from me. A week before the family court hearing, Dad's lawyer filed a motion to suppress almost everything we had. He argued the training log was stolen, the phone recording was entrapment, the search history was obtained improperly, and the ceremony audio violated privacy. Renata spent 3 straight days building her response, and she walked me through each argument so I'd understand what was at stake. The log was now properly subpoenaed and authenticated, so it stayed. The phone call was legal in a one-party consent state, so it stayed. The search history came through a valid court order, so it stayed. The ceremony audio was recorded in a public auditorium with 300 witnesses and a school system that owned the equipment, so there was no reasonable expectation of privacy, and it stayed. One by one, the judge denied Dad's motions in a pre-hearing conference, and Renata called me afterward sounding almost giddy, because the judge's willingness to let all of it in told her exactly how the man was already leaning, but Dad wasn't done. 2 days later, a classmate named Priya reached out to me on Instagram and said she'd been filming the award ceremony on her phone because her cousin was also getting an award, and that she had the whole collapse on video, including the audio of what I'd said into the microphone. She sent it to me, and watching it was surreal, seeing myself from the audience's angle, a boy in a jacket that swallowed him whole, folding to the floor, and then my own thin voice coming through clear, telling Dad he'd said I was too fat. Renata was thrilled because now we had the moment from 2 independent sources, the school's hearing assist system and a private phone, which made it impossible to argue either had been altered. She got Priya to sign a declaration about when and how she'd recorded it, and she added the video to the exhibit list. Around the same time, our grandfather started getting harassed. Dad's supporters found his address and left notes on his door, called his house at all hours, and one of them followed his car. My grandfather, who was 71 and just wanted to keep his grandsons fed, filed a police report and requested a protective order of his own. Renata used the harassment as more evidence of Dad's campaign of intimidation, documenting each incident and tying it back to Dad's public posts, because judges take a dim view of a parent whose followers terrorize the family caring for his children. Theo, meanwhile, was slowly coming back to life at our grandfather's house. Silas had started seeing him too, and in one of Theo's sessions he finally told the whole story of his own role, how Dad had made him crush the laxative pills into my food on the nights I was allowed to eat, how Dad had told him it was medicine, and that keeping the secret was proof he loved the family, how Dad had begun weighing Theo too in the last few weeks before everything fell apart, in the garage, at 6:55 in the morning, the exact same ritual. Hearing that Dad had already started the same clock on Theo made me physically sick, but it also gave the case something powerful, a second child describing the identical pattern independently, which no defense could wave away as one bitter teenager's exaggeration. Dr. Rhodes documented Theo's early malnutrition markers alongside mine and prepared to testify that the two children showed the same fingerprints of the same abuser. Then, 4 days before court, Dad tried one more thing. His lawyer reached out to Renata with a settlement offer. If we dropped our push for a no-contact order and agreed to reunification counseling with Dad, he would agree to supervised visits and would not contest Mom getting primary custody. Renata brought the offer to me in a quiet meeting and said the choice was mine, that some families take deals like this to avoid the trauma of testifying, that no one would think less of me. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to remember the tally marks in the garage, the granola bars in Theo's lunchbox that had almost become celery sticks, the search history aimed at my little brother's body. Then I told Renata no. I told her I hadn't starved myself half to death and clawed through every skeptical caseworker and every denied motion so that Dad could keep a foot in the door and start the clock all over again the moment everyone looked away. I told her I wanted to testify, I wanted the judge to hear all of it. I wanted the record to be so complete and so damning that Dad could never rewrite it. Renata looked at me for a long moment and then she smiled and said, "Then let's go in." The night before the hearing, Mom came to see me at the facility. She'd finished her parenting classes. She'd been sober from the wine she used to lean on during the worst months, and she sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to when I was small. She told me she would carry the guilt of missing it for the rest of her life, that she should have counted the times my plate was empty, that she'd trusted the wrong person and I'd paid for it. I told her the truth, that I'd spent 3 years believing no one would ever see me, and that when she stood up at the ceremony and screamed my name, it was the first time in years I'd felt like a person instead of a number on a scale. We stayed up late going over the plan, and for the first time since I was 11, I fell asleep in a room where the person watching over me was on my side. The family hearing got pushed a week because the criminal case and the custody case ended up scheduled too close together, and the judges wanted the custody matter to go first, so the criminal court could use its findings. That extra week turned into its own gauntlet. It started when the nurse who'd first written down my story, the one who changed my IV bag on the 3rd day, called Renata sounding frightened. Someone had shown up at his apartment building asking his neighbors about him, and he'd gotten anonymous messages telling him he'd be sorry if he testified about a family he knew nothing about. Renata reported it as witness intimidation and got the nurse added to a safety plan, but it shook me to realize Dad was willing to reach that far. It also, in a strange way, helped us, because intimidating a mandatory reporter is a crime, and Renata documented it as one more entry in the pattern of a man who controlled everyone around him through fear. A few days later, Wendell the investigator came back with something from the neighbors that none of us had thought to look for. The family across the street had a doorbell camera that recorded the street, and it had been quietly saving clips for over a year. Wendell pulled the archive with the neighbor's permission, and there it was, morning after morning, Mom's car backing out of the driveway at 6:52, 6:53, 6:54, and then the garage light clicking on seconds later. The camera couldn't see inside the garage, but it didn't need to. It showed, in date-stamped footage stretching back months, that the ritual I'd described started the instant Mom left, exactly as I'd said, exactly at the time I'd said. Renata layered the doorbell timestamps over the training log entries and the pharmacy dates until the three of them told one seamless story. Then Wendell went back to the house with Roland and a warrant for a second search of the garage, and this time, they found what the first search had missed. Behind the tool chest, under a tarp, was a small locked mini-fridge. Inside it were the foods Dad kept for himself and Theo on the days he denied me, and a spiral notebook, older than the training log, that went back even further, to when I was 10. It was Dad's first log, the prototype, the one where he'd worked out the system. The entries were colder than anything in the newer log. Calculations of how little a boy my size could eat and still walk to school, notes on which excuses worked on Mom and which teachers asked too many questions. Reading a photocopy of it in Renata's office, I finally understood that this had never been anger or discipline gone too far. It had been a plan, written down and refined for years. Renata had both logs authenticated by the same document examiner, and she prepared to enter them as the spine of the whole case. Meanwhile, the medical billing records for Theo's fake appointments came through, and they were their own kind of proof. Dad had taken Theo to a gastroenterologist 4 times in 2 months for symptoms Theo never had, and the billing notes showed Dad describing constipation and stomach pain and asking each time about treatments that happened to be laxatives. Dr. Rhodes reviewed the records and wrote that Dad appeared to be manufacturing a medical history for Theo, building the same paper trail of fake illness he could later use to explain away real starvation, exactly the way he'd tried to explain mine as an eating disorder. The guardian ad litem assigned to represent Theo and me in court, a soft-spoken woman named Ingrid who'd been doing this work for 20 years, spent a full afternoon interviewing each of us separately and then interviewing Dad. She came out of Dad's interview visibly disturbed, and she told Renata privately that in 2 decades she'd rarely met a parent so smooth and so hollow at the same time, a man who could recite the right words about love and protection without a single flicker of the thing itself behind his eyes. Her report to the court recommended in plain language that Dad have no unsupervised contact with either child, and that Mom, with the parenting classes and the home study behind her, receive full custody. Through all of this, my own recovery kept lurching forward and backward. I hit a milestone the week I finished a full plate of food without my chest tightening, and the nutritionist marked it on a chart she kept for me. Then I hit a wall the week I found myself, out of pure habit, measuring a portion with my eyes and hearing Dad's voice in my head announcing a number, and I had to call Silas at night to talk myself down. He told me that recovery isn't a straight line, that the man's voice would fade but it would take longer than the bruises, and that every time I chose to eat anyway, I was proving the voice wrong. Mom moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment and passed her home study, and Ingrid inspected it and noted that there was food in the fridge and no scale anywhere in the house. Slowly, the pieces of a normal life were being assembled while the legal war ground on around them. Renata deposed Dad the Thursday before the hearing, and she let me watch it later on video with Silas beside me in case it was too much. Dad sat at the head of a long conference table in a pressed shirt, calm and reasonable, calling me troubled and Mom controlling, and for the first 20 minutes he was flawless. Then Renata started walking him through the dates. She asked him to explain the 655 entries in his own handwriting, and he said they were reminders to check on his son's health. She asked why a health check required a scale hidden behind a tool chest, and he said the garage was simply where the scale lived. She asked about the mini fridge, and his jaw tightened for the first time. She read him a line from the older log, a calculation of how few calories a boy my weight could survive on, and asked him to explain it, and he said it was research any concerned parent might do. She asked why concerned research was locked in a fridge under a tarp, and he didn't answer. By the end, the smooth man was gone, and what was left was someone cold and irritated, a person who kept correcting Renata not on whether he'd done these things, but on the details of how, as if his real objection was being told he'd done them badly. Watching him, I understood something that helped me more than any therapy exercise. Dad wasn't sorry, and he was never going to be, and that meant nothing I did could disappoint him, because he'd never been on my side to begin with. That knowledge set me free in a way I can't fully explain. The criminal case moved in parallel, and at the preliminary hearing the judge found probable cause on all 3 counts, and bound the case over for trial. Dad's mother sat in the front row of the criminal courtroom in her church clothes, and afterward Renata's paralegal handed the defense a copy of the search history as part of routine discovery, and I later heard that my grandmother read it in the hallway and had to sit down. Whatever she told herself about her son, the searches aimed at Theo's body were a thing she couldn't fold into a story about a good man being railroaded. She never posted about the family again after that day, and she never came to another hearing. The district attorney offered Dad a plea, a deal that would have given him a shorter sentence and mandatory treatment in exchange for admitting what he'd done. His lawyer urged him to take it. Dad refused. He couldn't stand to say the words out loud, couldn't stand to sign a paper that said he'd starved his own son, and his arrogance in turning down that deal was, Renata told me, the best gift he could have given us, because it meant everything would come out in open court instead of being buried in a quiet plea. In the last few days before the family hearing, Dad's side made one final push to have my testimony thrown out. His lawyer filed a claim that I'd been coached, that Mom and Renata and Silas had rehearsed my story with me until it stopped being memory and became a script. It was a clever attack because in a way, it was true that I'd practiced, and Silas had worried about exactly this. But Renata had been ready for it for weeks. Every session I'd done with Silas had been documented, and Silas testified in an affidavit that his work with me had been about managing panic and staying calm, never about the content of what happened, that he had specifically refused to discuss the facts of the case, so no one could accuse him of shaping them. The facility even had general recordings of common area sessions that showed the therapy was about breathing and grounding, not about rehearsing accusations. The judge reviewed it and denied Dad's motion, ruling that preparing a traumatized witness to stay calm is not the same as coaching him to lie. That was the last brick Dad tried to pull out of the wall, and it held. The morning before court, Dad violated the no contact order one final time. He called me from a blocked number, and I recognized the voice before he even finished the first word. He didn't threaten me this time. He was quiet, almost gentle, and he told me it wasn't too late to be a family, that he forgave me, that a son's place was beside his father. I let him talk, and when he finished, I told him one true thing, that I remembered every morning, all of them, in groups of 7, and then I hung up and immediately reported the call to Roland, who documented the violation and added it to the stack. Renata said Dad simply could not stop reaching for control even when reaching cost him everything, and that this last call, made the night before a custody hearing in direct violation of a court order, was the perfect final note. I slept a few hours, and then it was time. It's strange to say, but some of the hardest work of those months had nothing to do with courtrooms. It happened at mealtimes. When I first got to the step-down facility, eating felt like a math problem I could never solve, because for 3 years, a plate of food had been a test I was designed to fail. The nutritionist there, a patient woman named Corinne, started me on what she called a meal plan, but what really felt like learning to walk again. The first week, a single single scrambled egg took me 40 minutes and left me shaking. The second week, I could finish a piece of toast without hearing Dad's voice announce a number in my head. Corinne never once told me I'd eaten too much, and the first time she said the words "good job" after I cleared a plate, I had to look away because no adult had ever said that to me about food. There was another kid at the facility named Jonah, who was a year younger and who had an actual eating disorder, the kind that grows inside a person rather than the kind that's forced on them from outside. And at first I didn't understand how we could be in the same place, but over time I saw that the pain landed in the same organs no matter where it came from, and Jonah and I would sit together at the hardest meal of the day, dinner, and just get through it side by side without talking. One night Jonah had a bad relapse and refused his tray, and I sat with him for 2 hours, and I realized that helping him eat was helping me eat, that being needed was its own kind of medicine. Corinne noticed and started seating the newer kids near me, and slowly, without meaning to, I became the person at the table who made it a little less terrifying for someone else. Meanwhile, the financial side of the case had grown into something enormous. Renata brought in a forensic accountant named Hollis to make sense of what Wendell had found, and Hollis reconstructed 2 years of Dad's spending down to the receipt. The picture he built was of a man who had systematically bankrupted the family while blaming the poverty on Mom's nursing hours. There was the secret account, the boat, the tools, the loans to Coach Renfro, and buried in all of it, in cold, regular increments, the laxatives, always cash back, always logged. Hollis testified in his deposition that the financial pattern showed premeditation and control, that Dad had engineered Mom's exhaustion and debt precisely so she'd be too overwhelmed to see what was on my plate. He built a single timeline that combined the money, the pharmacy runs, the doorbell footage, the school collapses, and my hospital admissions into one document, and when Renata showed it to me, it looked less like a legal exhibit and more like an x-ray of 3 years of my life. Then a witness came forward that none of us had expected. A man named Ford, who worked with Dad at the plant, reached out to the DA after seeing the news. He said that at the company's summer picnic a year earlier, he'd watched Dad refuse to let me eat, had heard Dad tell me in a low voice that I hadn't earned it, and had seen me stand at the edge of the food tables watching everyone else eat, with an expression Ford said he'd never been able to forget. Ford said he'd told himself it wasn't his business, that plenty of parents are strict, and that he'd carried the guilt of not saying anything ever since. His statement mattered because he had no stake in the family, no reason to lie, and because a picnic in front of Dad's co-workers proved the behavior wasn't hidden shame. It was so normalized in Dad's mind that he'd do it in public. Renata added Ford to the witness list. The school launched its own review, and the athletic trainer who documented all 17 of my collapses testified before the school board about how the system had failed to connect the incidents, and the board quietly overhauled its mandatory reporting procedures. The trainer found me afterward and apologized for every time she'd sent me back to class instead of calling someone, and I told her the truth, that her 17 incident reports were now some of the most important evidence in my case, that her careful documentation, even without action, had built the pattern that would help convict Dad. She cried, and I realized that a lot of the adults in my life were carrying guilt for the things they hadn't seen, and that part of my job now was to let them help set it right instead of drowning in it. There was a scare in the middle of all of it that nearly undid me. 2 weeks before trial, the criminal court got word that Dad had emptied what was left of the secret account and bought a one-way ticket to a state without an extradition habit of cooperating quickly. His lawyer swore it was a misunderstanding, a trip to see a sick relative, but the DA moved fast and the judge ordered Dad fitted with an ankle monitor and confined to the county. The night the order came down, I sat in the facility day room and watched the local news report that a father facing child abuse charges had been placed on electronic monitoring after an apparent flight attempt, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in months, which was safe. Renata told me the flight attempt was, legally, a confession without words because innocent men who believe they're being railroaded show up to clear their names. They don't buy one-way tickets. The victim advocate at the courthouse, a gentleman named Abel who'd worked with hundreds of kids, helped me prepare an impact statement for the criminal case, though that wouldn't be read until sentencing, if it ever came. He sat with me in a small room with buzzing fluorescent lights and let me talk for as long as I needed. And he taught me that an impact statement isn't about making the person feel bad. It's about putting on the record, permanently, what was taken from you. I wrote about the mornings, the scale, the number, the way I'd learned to make my body take up as little room as possible, the way I'd stopped raising my hand in class because I didn't have the energy, the friends I'd lost because I was too tired to be a friend. Abel recorded it and said it was one of the clearest statements he'd ever heard, and hearing that from a man who'd heard hundreds of them made me sit up a little straighter. A reporter from a regional paper, a bigger one than the local weekly, reached out and asked if I'd tell my story on the record after the case was resolved. I sat with that question for a long time. Part of me wanted to disappear, to eat my meals and rebuild my heart and never think about any of it again. But another part of me remembered how alone I'd been, how sure I'd been that no one would ever believe a boy could be starved by his father in a house full of food, and I thought about all the kids sitting at empty plates right now, telling themselves the same lie I'd told myself, that this was normal, that they deserved it. I told the reporter I'd think about it, and I did, and eventually I decided that when it was all over, I'd say yes, because the story that had almost killed me might be the exact thing that saved someone else. Something unexpected came out of Dad's own campaign too. One of his early online supporters, a man who donated to the fundraiser, sent me a long private message. He said that reading the court filings that had leaked had shaken something loose in him, that his own father had done something similar to him decades ago, that he'd spent his whole life telling himself it was discipline because the alternative was too much to hold. He said he was sorry he'd ever sent Dad money, that he'd only done it because Dad's story sounded exactly like the story his father used to tell about him. We messaged back and forth a few times, times, and he ended up giving a short statement to the DA about the general way abusers like Dad construct a public image of the wronged parent, though he wasn't a witness to my case specifically. Mostly though, that stranger taught me how far the poison spreads, how one man's lie can reach across a whole town and land in the wound of someone who's never met him. In the last week, I spent most of my time in Renata's office helping assemble the exhibit binder. It grew to 4 inches thick. There was the training log and the older prototype log, both authenticated. There were the pharmacy records highlighted in yellow. There was Hollis's financial timeline and Wendell's doorbell footage stills. There were the 2 independent recordings of the ceremony, the school's and Priya's. There were 17 incident reports from the trainer, 5 teacher statements, Ford's picnic account, Dr. Saw, Rhodes's 15-page report and her charts, the medical billing that showed Dad manufacturing Theo's fake illness, the guardian ad litem's recommendation, the parking lot custodial interference video, the witness intimidation reports, the settlement offer we'd refused, and Dad's own phone recording where he'd bragged about accountability and monitoring. Watching Renata label each exhibit with a neat sticker and slide it into a plastic sleeve, I understood that this binder was the opposite of the scale. The scale had been Dad's tool for making me disappear, one number at a time. The binder was the tool that would make everything he'd done impossible to look away from, one exhibit at a time. Dr. Rhodes came by the office one afternoon to walk me through the demonstrative timeline she'd built for the court. A single large chart with my weight plotted against Dad's laxative purchases and my collapses, every valley in the line connected by a red thread to a receipt and an incident report. She said charts like this let a judge see in 10 seconds what takes an hour to explain in words, and that no honest person could look at that descending red line and believe it was an accident. Theo, in all of this, was getting better. Our grandfather kept a standing rule at his house that nobody left the table until everyone was full, and Theo, who'd learned Dad's silence, slowly learned our grandfather's warmth instead. He started sleeping through the night. He started laughing again, the loud, clumsy laugh he'd had before Dad taught him to be careful. Every phone call with him was a little lighter than the last, and every time I heard that laugh, I remembered exactly what I was fighting for. A few days before the hearing, Dad's own lawyer started to come apart from him. Renata heard through the courthouse grapevine that the 2 of them had clashed badly over the plea, that the lawyer had wanted Dad to take the deal, and Dad had accused him of being on our side. The lawyer didn't withdraw because it was too late for that, but everyone could see he'd stopped believing his own client, and Renata said a defense attorney who's given up is a defense attorney who makes mistakes. It gave me a strange comfort to know that even the man paid to stand beside Dad couldn't stomach what he'd read in the file. The question of Theo testifying was one of the hardest we faced. He was 10, and no one wanted to put him on a stand across the room from the man who'd made him crush pills into his brother's food. Renata and Ingrid worked out an arrangement where the judge would interview Theo privately in chambers, with only Ingrid present, no lawyers, no Dad, so he could tell the truth without Dad's eyes on him. I helped Theo get ready the only way I knew how, the way Silas had taught me, by telling him to just say what happened and when, to not worry about big words or getting emotional, to remember that the judge only wanted the truth and that the truth was on his side. Theo asked me if Dad would be able to hear him, and I told him no, that this time Dad didn't get to be in the room, that this time it was Theo's turn to talk and Dad's turn to sit outside and wait. He nodded very seriously, the way he used to nod when Dad gave him a rule, except this time the rule was that he got to be safe. 2 days before court, I asked Roland if I could go back to the house one last time to get some of my things, the few books I still cared about, a photo of me and Mom from before everything, my grandfather's old watch that Dad had never known I'd hidden. Roland went with me, and Mom waited in the car because she couldn't bear to go inside. The house was smaller than I remembered, and colder. I got my books and the photo, and then I did the thing I told myself I wouldn't do. I went out to the garage. The scale was gone, taken as evidence, but the marks were still there, scratched into the concrete beside the empty space, hundreds of them in groups of 7, going up the wall. I stood there and counted a few of the groups, and Roland stood quietly behind me, and I realized I wasn't scared anymore. The marks weren't a record of my shame. They were a record of every single morning I'd survived a man who was trying, slowly and carefully, to erase me. I took a photo of them with my own phone, not for evidence. Renata already had 100, but for me, so I'd always remember exactly how many mornings I'd been strong enough to walk back out of that garage and go to school. Then I left, and I didn't look back. My recovery reached a milestone that same week, a small one that felt enormous. Corrine let me go on my first supervised outing, and Mom took me to a diner, a real one, with a laminated menu and a waitress who called me Han. I ordered a burger, a whole one, with fries, and I ate it, and halfway through I looked up and saw Mom watching me with tears running down her face, not sad tears, and I understood she was watching her son eat a meal in public for the first time in years without a father counting every bite. The waitress asked if everything was okay, and Mom laughed and said everything was perfect, and it was. Mom, for her part, had done the hard work of becoming someone I could trust again. She'd finished the parenting classes, passed the home study, gotten sober, and started her own therapy to understand how she'd missed it for so long. In our sessions with Silas together, she never made excuses, never once said she'd been fooled as a way of dodging responsibility. She said she'd been so exhausted and so broke, exactly the way Dad had engineered, that she'd handed the dinners over to him and never questioned it, and that she'd carry that for the rest of her life. She was terrified of testifying, and we practiced together, and I watched her learn the same lesson I had, to say what happened and when, to stick to the facts, to not let Dad's lawyer twist her guilt into an admission that she was the real problem. By the last practice session, she could describe the night she said she hadn't seen me eat in 3 days without her voice breaking. Outside the case, Dad's public world was collapsing in on itself. The fundraiser platform froze his account after enough people reported reported it, and the local news channel that had let him perform his grief quietly pulled the interview from its website once the parking lot video and the criminal charges came out. The comment sections that used to defend him turned. His mother had gone silent. Coach Renfro stopped returning his calls after the deposition. One by one, the people Dad had recruited into his story stepped back out of it, until the only person left telling it was Dad himself, alone, on an ankle monitor, in a house with no family in it. Silas told me that this was what always happened eventually, that a lie needs constant maintenance, and an abuser eventually runs out of hands to prop it up, and that the truth, however slow, simply waits longer than the lie can. In my last session before court, Silas didn't run drills, he just talked to me. He said that tomorrow Dad's lawyer would try 3 things: that he'd try to make me angry so I'd look unstable, that he'd try to confuse the timeline so I'd contradict myself, and that he'd try to make me feel sorry for Dad so I'd soften. He said the answer to all 3 was the same: come back to the fact, come back to the date, come back to the number. He had me say my anchor out loud one more time, the sentence I'd hold on to no matter what they threw at me. 6:55 in the morning, the scale in the garage, the number decided if I ate. I said it flat and steady, the way he'd taught me, and Silas nodded and said I was ready, and then he told me the one thing that stayed with me all night, that a witness who tells the truth doesn't have to remember a story because the truth is already remembered. It just has to be told. That night I called Theo and we didn't talk about court at all. We talked about a video game he was playing at Grandpa's and a dog on Grandpa's street that Theo had started feeding, and I let his ordinary happy voice be the last thing I heard before I tried to sleep. The morning of the hearing, Mom drove me to the courthouse and my heart was doing the skipping thing again, but I'd learned by then that a racing heart isn't the same as being in danger, so I breathed through it. There were a few of Dad's supporters outside with signs, fewer than there'd once been, maybe 5 people where there used to be dozens, and they shouted things as we walked past, but their words slid off me. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, with a long table for us and a long table for Dad, and a raised bench where the judge sat sorting through papers. Dad was already there in a dark suit, and when I walked in, he looked at me the way he used to look at the scale, like I was a number he was trying to read, and for one second the old fear reached up my spine. Then I remembered the marks in the garage, all the mornings I'd survived him, and I looked away first, not because I was scared, but because he simply wasn't worth the look. Renata squeezed my shoulder and whispered that our witnesses were all confirmed and waiting, that Dr. Rhodes and Hollis and Wendell and Ford and the nurse and the trainer and Mr. Austell were all in the hall, that Roland and Ingrid were seated behind us, that Priya's video was cued and the recordings were loaded. The judge, a lean older man with reading glasses and a quiet, unhurried way of speaking, called the room to order and denied one last motion from Dad's lawyer, a request to delay citing Dad's stress, which the judge dismissed in a single sentence, noting that the court had accommodated the defense's schedule more than enough. Then the judge looked over his glasses at Renata and told her to call her first witness, and Renata stood, and she looked at me, and she said the words I'd been walking toward for months. She called me to the stand. My stomach was doing flips as I walked to the witness stand, and I put my hand on the Bible even though my fingers were shaking. Renata asked me to describe the morning weigh-ins, and I told them about standing on that hidden scale in the garage at 6:55 a.m. every single day while Mom's car pulled out of the driveway. I explained how Dad would announce my weight and decide if I got to eat based on the number, keeping my voice steady even when Dad started sobbing loudly at his table. Renata asked about the food restrictions, and I listed everything: the 3 celery sticks, the single rice cake, watching my family eat pizza while I had ice water. Dad's crying got louder, but I just kept talking, telling them about the laxatives Theo put in my food on Dad's orders, and how I collapsed at the school over and over. I told them about the granola bars in Theo's lunchbox, and the celery in mine. I told them about the day Dad ate dinner across from me for the 100th time, and never once looked at my plate. I told them about the mirror, and the morning I decided the only way anyone would ever see me was to stop eating entirely. When I finished the direct, the whole courtroom was quiet, except for Dad's fake sniffles, and the judge wrote something down without looking up. Then Dad's lawyer stood for the cross, and I remembered exactly what Silas had told me he would try. First, he tried to make me angry. He asked me whether I'd ever lied to my father, whether I'd ever snuck food behind his back, whether I was really so helpless, or whether I'd been a difficult teenager exaggerating a strict but loving dad. I came back to the fact. I said Dad weighed me at 6:55 every morning and decided if I ate based on the number, and I said it flat, and the anger he was fishing for never came. Then he tried to confuse the timeline. He jumped between years, asked me to pin down exact dates from when I was 11, tried to catch me contradicting myself between the ceremony and the hospital. I came back to the date. I told him I couldn't give him the exact date of every morning, but I could tell him the time, 6:55, and I could tell him the place, the garage, and I could tell him that it happened every single day for 3 years, and that the doorbell camera across the street and the log in Dad's own handwriting could fill in the dates I couldn't. He didn't like that answer, and he moved on. Then he tried the last thing, the softening. He lowered his voice and asked me whether I loved my father, whether I understood that Dad believed he was helping me, whether a boy my age could really judge a parent's intentions. I came back to the number. I told him that a father who loves his son doesn't lock a mini fridge in the garage and calculate how few calories the boy can survive on, and that I didn't need to judge Dad's intentions because Dad had written them down himself in 2 notebooks over 3 years. The lawyer paused, and then he said he had no further questions, and I understood from the way he sat back down that he'd known before he started that there was nothing he could do. Renata told me later that in 15 years, she'd rarely seen a witness hold an anchor that steady, and that the moment I stopped his 3 attacks with 3 facts was the moment she knew we'd already won, even with all the evidence still waiting. Mr. Austell took the stand next and pulled out his laptop to play the audio from the award ceremony. ceremony. The sound filled the courtroom, my voice coming through the speakers saying, "Dad told me I was too fat every morning when he weighed me." Then Dad's panicked screaming, trying to force food into my mouth. Then Theo's small scared voice about the laxatives. The judge's face got harder and harder as he listened, his pen tapping against the bench. When it finished, Mr. Ostel explained that the recording came from the school's own hearing assist system, that the school owned the equipment, and that 300 people had witnessed the moment live. Then Renata did something that made Dad's lawyer half rise from his chair. She played the same moment again, but from a completely different source. A phone video shot by a student in the audience named Priya, showing me from the front as I folded to the floor, my voice matching the first recording word for word. 2 independent recordings of the same moment, she told the judge. Impossible to stage, impossible to alter, corroborating each other perfectly. The judge asked for both to be entered into evidence, and Dad's lawyer sat back down without a word. The athletic trainer testified after that, bringing all 17 incident reports she'd documented over 2 years, reading a few of the worst ones into the record, the dates and times I'd fainted or gone gray, or had to be walked to the nurse's office. She was followed by the substance of 5 teacher statements Renata read into the record, my history teacher describing me falling asleep standing up, my chemistry teacher finding me passed out in the bathroom and being begged not to call anyone, all of them noting the weight loss and the borrowed-looking clothes, all of them mandatory reporters whose careful notes now formed an unbroken chain of concern. Then Ford, Dad's co-worker, took the stand, a big quiet man who twisted his hands in his lap and said he'd carried the guilt of the company picnic for over a year. He described watching Dad refuse to let me eat in front of everyone, hearing Dad tell me in a low voice that I hadn't earned it, and seeing me stand at the edge of the food tables watching everyone else eat. He said he told himself it wasn't his business, and he apologized to me directly from the stand, and I nodded to let him know it was all right, that his coming forward now was what mattered. The nurse who'd first written down my story testified about that third day in the hospital, about how I'd finally found the courage to describe the weigh-ins and the laxatives while he changed my IV bag, and he confirmed that he'd documented it contemporaneously, in careful handwriting, the same day I told him, long before any lawyer had shaped a word of it. Dr. Rhodes came up after that with a whole folder of charts and medical reports. She put her demonstrative timeline on a screen and showed the pattern of malnutrition going back 3 years, my weight plotted as a long descending line, every valley connected by a red thread to a laxative purchase and a school collapse. She explained how the damage to my heart and organs matched systematic starvation, not self-imposed restriction, how my bone density resembled that of an elderly man, how the refeeding syndrome that nearly killed me in the hospital was the signature of a body starved for years, not weeks. She pointed to specific dates where my weight dropped and matched them to Dad's laxative purchases, speaking in a calm, professional voice that made everything sound even worse. Then she did the thing that made the judge set down his pen entirely. She testified that she'd examined Theo, and that Theo, at 10, was already showing the earliest markers of the same pattern. A weight drop, low iron, a manufactured medical history of stomach problems he didn't have. She said in plain clinical language that this was medical child abuse, not a psychiatric eating disorder, and that the same fingerprints appeared on both children, 3 years apart, exactly as you'd expect from a single abuser working through a system he'd refined. Dad's lawyer objected twice, and the judge told him twice to sit down and let the doctor finish. Wendell, the investigator, came next and walked the court through the doorbell footage, morning after morning of Mom's car backing out at 6:52 and 6:53 and 6:54, the garage light clicking on seconds later, the timestamps lining up precisely with the log entries. Then he described the second search of the garage, the mini fridge locked behind the tool chest, and the older prototype notebook, the one that went back to when I was 10, where Dad had first worked out how little a boy my size could eat and still walk to school. Renata entered photographs of the mini fridge and the tally marks scratched into the concrete, hundreds of them in groups of 7, and I watched the judge study those photos for a long time. Hollis, the forensic accountant, followed and laid out the money, the secret account, the boat, the loans, the 2 years of engineered debt that had kept Mom too exhausted and too broke to notice what was on my plate, and the regular cashback laxative purchases buried in the statements. He testified that the financial patterns showed premeditation and control, that Dad hadn't lost his temper, he'd built a machine. The document examiner testified last of the experts, confirming that both notebooks were written in Dad's hand, and that the ink and paper aging proved they'd been kept over years, killing any argument that the logs were recent fakes. Roland was next, and he brought the whole weight of the investigation with him. He testified about the case from the first hospital interview, when Dad had sat beside my bed sobbing and talking over me, to the moment the evidence finally became impossible to explain away. He entered the pharmacy timeline, showing that every 2 to 3 weeks for 2 years, Dad had bought the same brand of laxatives in bulk, always cashback, always logged, and that the purchase dates matched my worst collapses, including the week he bought 3 boxes right before I went down during finals. Then Renata asked him about the court-ordered search of Dad's phone, and the room got very still. Roland described the search history, a man who had researched exactly how far he could push a growing boy's body, who had looked up the warning signs doctors watch for and how to explain them away, who had studied how abuse investigations start and how fathers keep custody, with searches timed to the exact weeks I'd collapsed. And then he described the part that made a woman in the gallery gasp out loud. In the 2 weeks after I was removed from the house, the searches had changed. They were no longer about me. They were about Theo, the same body, the same methods, the same explanations, aimed at a 10-year-old. The judge asked Roland to confirm the dates, and Roland confirmed them, and the judge wrote for a long time. Roland also played the parking lot footage, Dad's truck idling at the school curb curb, Dad leaning out the window trying to talk Theo into running away with him, the teacher stepping between them, and he entered the reports of witness intimidation, the nurse's frightened neighbors, my grandfather's harassment, Dad's followers calling the facility, tying each incident back to Dad's own public posts. When Dad's lawyer tried to suggest the searches could have been anyone in the household, Roland pointed out that the phone was Dad's, logged into Dad's accounts, and that the searches continued during the weeks I was in a hospital, and Theo was the only child left in the house. The lawyer had no follow-up. Ingrid, the guardian ad litem, testified after Roland, and she carried a different kind of authority, the calm of a woman who had spent 20 years watching families come apart and had learned to tell the real thing from the performance. She described interviewing each of us, Theo and me and Dad, and she told the court carefully and without drama that in 2 decades she had rarely met a parent so fluent in the language of love and so empty of the thing itself. She said Dad could recite every right word about protecting his sons without a single flicker behind his eyes, and that both children, interviewed separately, had described the identical ritual, the identical scale, the identical time of mourning, in a way no one had coached and no one could fake. Her recommendation to the court was unambiguous, that Dad have no unsupervised contact with either child under any circumstances, and that Mom, with the parenting classes and the home study and the sobriety behind her, receive full custody. She said, looking directly at the judge, that in her professional opinion, the danger to both children was ongoing and specific, and that the youngest child was, at that very moment, standing at the beginning of the same road his brother had nearly died on. Mom took the stand after Ingrid, and I watched her do the hardest thing I'd ever seen her do. She didn't hide behind being fooled. She told the court plainly that she had handed the dinners to Dad because she was exhausted from double shifts and drowning in debt. Debt she now understood Dad had built on purpose, and that she had trusted the wrong person, and her son had paid for it with his heart and his bones. She described the night she realized she hadn't seen me eat in 3 days, and the ceremony where she'd stood and screamed my name when my body folded to the floor. Dad's lawyer tried gently to turn her guilt into a confession, asking whether she too had commented on my weight, whether she'd enforced Dad's rules, whether she was really so blind, or whether she'd been complicit. She came back to the facts the same way I had, steady, unshaken, saying that she had never weighed me, never restricted my food, never touched the scale in the garage she hadn't even known existed, and that her failure had been not seeing, which she would carry forever, but that not seeing and doing were not the same crime. The lawyer let her go. Theo didn't have to sit in that room across from Dad. The judge had interviewed him privately in chambers with only Ingrid present, and when the judge returned, he noted for the record that he'd spoken with the younger child, that the child had described, independently and without prompting, a hidden scale in the garage, a weighing at 6:55 in the morning, and a father who had recently begun the same ritual with him that he had used on his brother. The judge said the younger child's account was consistent in every material detail with the older child's testimony and with the physical and medical evidence, and that he found the child credible. Then, finally, Dad took the stand. His lawyer tried to guide him through safe answers, tried to keep him to the script of the confused, loving father, but Dad couldn't help himself, the same way I'd been told he wouldn't be able to. He started talking about how boys today are soft, how a father's job is to build discipline, how a scale is just a tool for accountability and structure. The judge asked him directly whether he had weighed his son every morning, and decided whether the boy ate based on the number, and Dad, instead of denying it, said that monitoring a child's weight was part of responsible parenting. His lawyer closed his eyes. The judge asked about the mini-fridge and the calculations in the older notebook, and Dad said a concerned parent does research. The judge asked why that research was locked in a garage and timed to his son's collapses, and Dad's voice rose, and he started lecturing the courtroom about softness and strength, and how no one understood what it took to raise a son right, and the more he talked, the more the room understood exactly who he was. He talked about portion control and earning meals and building character through hunger, and he said the word discipline so many times it stopped sounding like a word. The judge finally cut him off and said he'd heard enough. Renata stood for her closing, and she didn't raise her voice once. She walked the court back through the whole binder, 4 inches thick, exhibit by exhibit, and as she named each one, I felt 3 years of my life being set down on the record where no one could ever take it back. She held up the 2 notebooks in Dad's own handwriting, the prototype from when I was 10, and the training log that followed, and she said this was a man who wrote his cruelty down and refined it. She pointed to the pharmacy timeline and the financial forensics and said this was a man who bought the poison in bulk and bankrupted his family to hide it. She played, one more time, 10 seconds of the ceremony audio, my thin voice telling him he'd said I was too fat, and then 10 seconds of the phone call where Dad had bragged about accountability and monitoring, and she let the 2 recordings sit in the silence next to each other. She showed the doorbell footage and the tally marks and the mini fridge photos. She reminded the court of the 17 incident reports and the 5 teachers and the co-worker at the picnic and the nurse's contemporaneous notes. She held up Dr. Rhodes's descending red line and said this was not the pattern of a boy who chose to stop eating, it was the pattern of a boy who was stopped from eating. And then she turned to the part that mattered most, and she said that this case was not only about what had already been done to me, but about what was being done right now to a 10-year-old, that the search history and the fake gastro appointments and Dr. Rhodes's examination of Theo all pointed to the same machine starting up again on a second child, and that the court had the rare and terrible privilege of seeing the beginning of an abuse it could actually stop. She said that Dad had been given every chance to show remorse, and had instead, on the stand, under oath, defended weighing his son every morning as good parenting, and that a man who cannot recognize starvation as harm even in a courtroom will not recognize anything.